Welcome back to the deep dive. This is our third, and I have to say, probably the most poignant part of our journey through ancient Egypt.
It really is.
We started with the colossal monuments, the unification. We went through the glory and the imperialism of the new kingdom. And now we have to look at what happens when a civilization that's lasted 3,000 years finally faces its twilight.
It's the long fade. That's really the only way to describe it. We're charting Egypt's path from the absolute catastrophe of the Bronze Age collapse right through centuries of foreign rule.
And it's a long list. We're
Yeah.
talking Libyan, Nubian, Persian.
All of them, all the way up to the arrival of Alexander the Great, the rise of the Ptolemies, and then, of course, the final absorption into the Roman Empire.
I think the question that hangs over all of this, for us and for any historian, is how does something that big, that ancient, that deeply rooted, how does it actually end? Is it a big bang, a sudden collapse?
And that's what's so fascinating here. Egypt completely avoids that kind of dramatic, singular catastrophe that, say, ended the Western Roman Empire. There's no one date where you can say, that's it, it's over.
So it doesn't fall, it just fades.
It faded. It was conquered, yes, repeatedly, starting around the 11th century BC. But the culture itself, wow, it proved to be astoundingly resilient. It was like this gravitational force that just pulled in and absorbed almost every invader for over 1,000 years.
That idea of cultural gravity, that's key, isn't it? The idea that even with a foreign king on the throne of the pharaohs, the actual machinery of Egypt just kept running.
Absolutely. I mean, think about the sheer depth of tradition we're talking about here. We're talking 3,000 years. So when the Libyans were in charge, the temples were still running.
The rituals were still being performed.
Exactly. The priests are still doing their thing. And crucially, the farmers are still working the Nile's flood cycles just like they had since the very first dynasties. The whole internal rhythm of Egypt, its bureaucracy, its religion, it just outlasted its conquerors. It reshaped them.
So the mission for this deep dive, then, is to really get into the mechanics of that absorption and try to pinpoint when that incredible mechanism finally broke down. Where does this long fade even begin?
We have to start with the foundational trauma, the event that just shattered the entire Eastern Mediterranean world. We have to talk about the Sea Peoples.
Right. During the reign of Ramses III around, 1180 BC?
Around 1180 BC, yes. And that date, it's more than just a date. It's like a historical demarcation line. It signals the end of that entire sophisticated, interconnected Bronze Age world. It wasn't just an invasion. It was a global system failure.
That's a much better way to put it. Because for almost everyone else, this was the end of their world as they knew it.
Oh, completely. For the Hittite Empire, for Mycenaean Greece, it was a civilization ender. Egypt was facing this existential threat that came, boiling out of the Mediterranean, driven by this massive, chaotic displacement of people. The Egyptians just called them the Sea Peoples.
Who were they? I mean, do you have any real idea? Were they pirates, an army, refugees?
Well, that's the mystery. They weren't a single unified army. It was more like a vast, loose confederation of different groups. They were probably all just migrating, looking for new lands because their own homes had collapsed for some reason.
And we only know them by the names the Egyptians gave them.
Exactly. Names like the Peliset, who some scholars think were the ancestors of the Philistines, the Chaker, the Shardana, who are often linked with Sardinia,
Okay, see.
the Shekelish from Sicily, the Luca from Anatolia. The point is, their movement wasn't about conquest for tribute. This was mass migration for survival.
So if we pull back and look at the context, that moment around 1200 BC, what was the domino effect that set this all off?
The scale of the collapse is, it's honestly hard for us to grasp today. All the great, long-standing diplomatic and economic ties, they just vanished.
Gone.
The Hittite Empire, which was this huge power in Anatolia and the Levant, completely destroyed, disappeared from the historical record. Their capital city, Hattusa, was just abandoned.
And Greece.
Mycenaean Greece falls into a dark age that lasts 4 centuries. They lose their writing system, Linear B, and the international trade that powered the whole Bronze Age economy, the trade in copper and tin, it just stops.
So that intricate supply chain, which must have required huge amounts of trust and centralized power to manage, it just shatters.
It completely fractures. Cities all across the Levant, Ugarit, Megiddo, they were burned to the ground. So in that context, Ramesses III's battles weren't just about defending a border. This was a frantic, desperate fight to hold the very structure of the Egyptian state together while the whole world was on fire.
So how did Egypt, pretty much alone among all the great powers, manage to survive this?
Ramesses III, he showed Really remarkable strategic foresight. He fortified the coastlines, he organized his navy, and he managed to marshal all of Egypt's internal resources. We know from the records he fought two huge decisive battles.
Okay.
First, a land battle up in the Levant to try and slow them down, and then the really critical one, a naval battle right in the Nile Delta.
And this is the battle that's still carved on the walls of his temple today.
Yes, the magnificent reliefs at his mortuary temple Medinet Habu. I mean, it's propaganda, of course, but it captures the sheer brutality of the fight. You see Egyptian archers just raining arrows down on these enemy ships.
It's so vivid.
It is. In the naval scenes, you can really see the tactical difference. The Egyptian ships had Marines on board, and they're shown boarding the enemy vessels, capsizing them, using grappling hooks. It was brutal, close-quarters combat, and they won. They pushed the invaders back from the Delta.
A huge military success that Egypt survives. But you called it a Pyrrhic victory. So what was the real long-term cost?
It was a survival that fundamentally broke Egypt's role as an imperial power. They won the battle, but they lost the war for global influence. They immediately lost control of all their territories in the Levant.
And the trade routes.
The vital trade routes were permanently shattered, and that meant key imports, like the high-quality timber they needed from Byblos, copper from Cyprus. It all became incredibly scarce and expensive.
And if the trade is gone and the tribute from the empire has dried up, the state must have been under enormous economic strain at home, especially after fighting this hugely expensive war.
Exactly right. The costs of mobilizing those armies, of maintaining those defenses, of just feeding the population during the crisis, it led to massive internal inflation and economic hardship, and we see direct evidence of this decay in documents that survived.
Like what?
Well, for instance, later in the Ramesside period, we have the records of the famous Turin Strike papyrus. It details how the tomb workers in the Valley of the Kings, the most prestigious craftsmen in the country, went on strike because they hadn't been paid or given their food rations.
Wow. That level of labor unrest right at the heart of the royal system, that's a huge red flag.
It's a profound indicator of systemic failure. So yes, Ramesses III saved the state, but in doing so, he bankrupted the empire and really accelerated the internal decay. And that leads us directly into this period of fragmentation.
The third intermediate period.
Right. It's an era defined by political division, by foreign influence, and just a severe loss of that central authority that had defined Egypt for so long. The Ramesside line just gets weaker and weaker.
And where did that centralized power first start to slip away? Where did the cracks appear?
It slipped away to the most powerful, wealthiest, and ideologically important institution outside of the pharaoh's palace.
The priesthood.
The priesthood. Specifically, the incredibly powerful high priests of Amun at Thebes, the religious capital. By the end of the 20th dynasty, they were basically independent rulers in Upper Egypt. They controlled vast amounts of land, huge resources, and their authority came directly from the god Amun.
So Egypt is split again. You have a pharaoh often ruling weakly from a northern city like Canis, and then this virtual theocracy in the south.
And that kind of chaos creates a power vacuum. It's the perfect opportunity for the first of these foreign dynasties to step in.
And that brings us to the Libyans.
The Libyans. And they were already deeply integrated into Egyptian society. We're talking about the chiefs of the Ma tribes, who had been settling in the Western Delta for centuries, mostly working as mercenaries and laborers. They already understood the system from the inside.
So they weren't exactly invaders storming the gates. They were more like internal power brokers who saw their chance and took it.
Precisely. Around 945 BC, a Libyan general named Shishonk was powerful enough to just seize the throne, establishing the 22nd dynasty. And these Libyan kings ruled for about 200 years. And this is where we really see that concept of cultural resilience in action.
Okay, so how do they do it? How do these foreign kings get the legitimacy they need to rule this ancient, proud nation?
By completely submitting to Egyptian tradition. They didn't impose the Libyan language or their own gods, not at all. They adopted the full Egyptian royal titles, they worshipped the Egyptian gods, especially Amun, and they built temples in the traditional Egyptian style.
So they just became Egyptian.
They became Egyptian. They cemented their rule through strategic marriages with powerful Egyptian families and, very smartly, by installing their own sons and relatives into key priestly roles, especially that all-powerful high priesthood of Amun down in Thebes.
It's governance by co-option. They realized they needed the ancient system to function for them to have any authority at all.
Let's pause on a word you keep using, Mahat. You've defined it as cosmic order, but what did that mean in a practical sense? What did a Libyan pharaoh actually have to do to maintain Ma'at?
That's a vital distinction. Ma'at is the foundational concept of Egyptian civilization.
Hmm.
Truth, justice, order, balance. For a pharaoh, maintaining it wasn't some abstract philosophical exercise. It was a job description.
Right.
It meant making sure the Nile flooded properly and that the irrigation systems were managed. It meant administering justice through the courts. It meant protecting the temples and funding the rituals that kept the gods happy and the universe in balance. A Libyan pharaoh who did all those things, who kept the machine running, was seen as legitimate regardless of where his ancestors came from. That's fascinating. The system was so robust it basically forced invaders to become Egyptian just to keep the lights on. But this period of Libyan rule eventually gives way to a much more surprising power shift.
Oh, absolutely. The next group of rulers to take the throne came from the far south, from the powerful kingdom of Kush, centered on Napata in what is now Sudan. They established the 25th dynasty.
The Kingdom of Kush. Wasn't that once an Egyptian colony back in the New Kingdom? How on earth did they end up as the saviors of Egyptian tradition?
That is the great historical irony. While the Libyan pharaohs were focused on, political control and managing their decentralized power bases, the Kushites had absorbed Egyptian culture so completely, the architecture, the hieroglyphs, the worship of Amun, that they looked north at these squabbling little states and they saw heretics.
They saw a culture that had lost its way.
Exactly. They saw themselves as the true guardians of Ma'at, the keepers of the purest form of Egyptian tradition. They weren't conquerors coming for loot. They were religious conservatives on a mission of restoration. So around 747 BC, the great Kushite king Pi marches north and conquers all of Egypt, establishing the rule of the so-called Black Pharaohs. And their mission was explicit: restore the glory of the centralized state and correct the decades of neglect the temples had suffered.
So what was their impact during the century or so that they ruled? What did they change?
Their impact was one of intense, deliberate traditionalism. We call it archaism. They intentionally looked back past the New Kingdom, which they saw as maybe too flashy and international, and they copied the art, the inscriptions, even the pyramid shapes of the Old and Middle Kingdoms.
Periods they associated with purity and stability.
Yes. They saw those eras as a golden age. They poured money into restoring ancient temples, trying to make the country look and feel like it had 1,500 years earlier. They even started building their own pyramids back in their homeland, a practice Egypt itself had abandoned centuries before.
That is just a profound dynamic. You have this golden age renaissance being driven by foreigners who feel a deeper connection to the culture than the native-born rulers who came before them. But their story, like the Libyans, ends because of an even bigger external force.
The world was changing. The shift from the small, fragmented states of the intermediate period to the massive, brutal empires of the Iron Age it was a shock. The end for the Kushites came from the east, with the terrifying efficiency of the Neo-Assyrian Empire.
Right, the dominant military power at the time.
By far. The Assyrians were ruthless, they were expansionist, and they were technologically superior.
Why was Egypt such a target for them?
A few reasons. Primarily, it was about strategic depth and resources. Egypt was still immensely wealthy, especially in grain, and it was the historical staging ground for anyone trying to cause trouble in the Levant. The Kushite pharaohs kept supporting these anti-Assyrian revolts in places like Palestine, and the Assyrians just would not tolerate that.
So the Assyrian response was decisive.
It was overwhelming. In 671 BC, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invades and captures Memphis. The Kushite royal family is forced to flee back south to Nubia. But the ultimate shock, the moment that really defined this low point for Egyptian sovereignty, came in 664 BC. Ashurbanipal, Esarhaddon's successor, marches his army south and systematically sacks the city of Thebes.
The sacking of Thebes. I mean,
Yeah.
that must have been an unbelievable psychological blow to the nation.
Beyond devastating, Thebes wasn't just another city. It was the religious heart of Egypt for over a millennium. It was the city of Amun, a place people believed was literally protected by the gods.
And the Assyrians just tore it apart.
They did. They looted its temples, they took its people prisoner, they demolished its great monuments. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was designed to utterly break the spirit and the wealth of the Egyptian nation. The Assyrian records actually gloat about the destruction of this great, beautiful city.
That's a huge contrast to the cultural absorption we saw with the Libyans and the Nubians. The Assyrians didn't adopt Ma'at. They shattered it.
They did, but here's the thing. They didn't stay. The Assyrian Empire was huge, but it was chronically overstretched. Trying to maintain control over a place as distant and rebellious as Egypt was just too costly. So once they'd made their point, they installed some local puppet rulers and retreated. And this brief vacuum, it allowed for a rebirth.
A chance for native Egyptians to reclaim the throne.
Yes. Out of that chaos emerged the 26th dynasty, ruling from the city of Sais in the Delta. They lasted from 664 to 525 BC, and this was Egypt's last real period of native independence, known as the Saite Renaissance.
A renaissance. So they were consciously trying to rebuild and look back to past glories.
They were, but they were very specific about which glories they looked back to. They weren't trying to copy the imperial model of the new kingdom that had just failed catastrophically against Assyria. Instead, they consciously looked all the way back to the stability and the centralized control of the Old Kingdom. Their art uses these archaizing styles. It's deliberately stiff, formal, not militaristic at all. It was meant to evoke this mythical age of purity and stability before all the foreign entanglements.
That's a fascinating choice. They chose the symbol of stability, the pyramid builders, over the symbol of military might, the New Kingdom conquerors. What was their policy toward the outside world?
Pragmatism. Pure pragmatism. They knew they needed allies against the new great powers emerging in the Near East. First Assyria, then Babylon, and then Persia. So they actively courted Greek mercenaries and settlers. They gave them specific trading rights and settlements, especially in the Delta. This period sees a huge influx of Greek traders and soldiers, which brings new energy and technology into the Egyptian economy.
So they bought their independence with Greek manpower, and their foreign policy was defined by this constant external pressure. It sounds, well, precarious.
It was incredibly precarious. Their independence was always conditional on the balance of power in the Near East. And that balance shifted decisively in 525 BC when the colossal Achaemenid Persian Empire arrived, led by King Cambyses.
The Persian invasion, was it a long, drawn-out war?
No, it was swift and brutal. The Egyptian resistance just crumbled at the Battle of Clusium. There's a famous story, it might be apocryphal, that the Persians used cats and other sacred animals as shields, knowing the Egyptians would be too afraid to harm them.
Wow.
Whether it's true or not, the message was clear. Egypt just could not stand against the sheer scale of Persian military power. It became a Persian province, a satrapy.
So how did the Persians, rulers of the biggest empire the world had ever seen, govern this ancient sacred land?
Initially, with a lot of calculated pragmatism, especially under Darius I. Darius was a brilliant administrator. He understood that to govern Egypt, you had to respect its traditions. He had himself depicted as a legitimate pharaoh in temple reliefs. He upheld Mot, and he formalized the administration.
What kind of administrative changes are we talking about?
Well, he introduced standardized coinage, which made trade across the empire much easier. He supported the existing Egyptian law codes. And most famously, he completed a project that was basically a precursor to the Suez Canal, a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea.
That's a massive undertaking.
It was. It vastly increased the wealth and strategic importance of Egypt by connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean trade routes.
That's very sophisticated governance. They integrated Egypt into their system while keeping up the appearance of cultural respect. But that didn't last, did it?
No.
Yeah.
Later Persian rulers became much more heavy-handed. They demanded higher taxes. They interfered with the priesthoods. They acted like foreign overlords, not pharaohs. And this provoked repeated, fierce revolts. The Egyptians actually managed to kick the Persians out and stay independent for about 60 years, from 404 to 343 BC.
That must have been a period of constant warfare.
Absolutely. They were just consumed by it. So when the Persians finally reconquered Egypt in 343 BC, they were not in a forgiving mood. This second period of Persian rule was marked by brutality. Sources talk about the looting of temples, the killing of sacred animals, all calculated insults designed to crush the Egyptian spirit.
So by the time the next great conqueror shows up on the horizon, the Egyptians are just desperate for anyone else.
Completely desperate. And in 332 BC, Alexander the Great marches into Egypt. He'd already defeated the main Persian army, so when he arrived, he wasn't met as a conqueror. He was hailed as a liberator from the hated Persians. The transition was essentially bloodless.
And Alexander, being a master of political theater, knew exactly what to do to cement his power there.
He absolutely did. He made that famous, incredibly arduous journey across the desert to the Oracle of Amun at the Siwa Oasis. We don't know exactly what happened in there, but the political result was crystal clear. Alexander was allegedly proclaimed the son of the god Amun.
which gave him the instant divine legitimacy he needed to be pharaoh.
Exactly. He just inserted himself perfectly into the millennial-old story of Egyptian kingship.
And his most lasting legacy in Egypt, the city he founded, it fundamentally reoriented the entire nation.
The founding of Alexandria. He chose a prime spot right on the Mediterranean coast. It was designed from the ground up to be a Greek-style capital, a global hub for trade, a city that faced outward toward the Greek world, not inward toward the old Nile centers like Memphis and Thebes. That single decision put Egypt on a Hellenistic cosmopolitan path for the next 300 years.
But Alexander, of course, died young, leaving this massive empire basically up for grabs.
Which led to the Wars of the Diadochi, his generals violently carving up the empire for themselves. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted commanders. He secured Egypt and established a new Macedonian Greek dynasty, the Ptolemaic dynasty, that lasted from 305 BC all the way to 30 BC.
So now we have Macedonian Greeks on the throne of the pharaohs. That must have created an astonishingly complex society.
It created this sophisticated but very high-tension dual system. On one side, you had the ruling class, the Ptolemies, their court, the army, the bureaucracy, all completely Greek-speaking, all centered on Alexandria, which was a hub for Greek philosophy, science, and literature.
But on the other side, you have the vast majority of the population, the temple system, the entire agricultural economy, all of which remained profoundly Egyptian.
Precisely. And the Ptolemies were nothing if not practical. They needed the Egyptian temple system to run the country, to collect taxes, to maintain order. So to the Egyptian people, they meticulously presented themselves as legitimate pharaohs. They upheld Ma'at, they gave huge grants of land and money to the priesthoods, and they funded the construction of some of the most spectacular Egyptian temples that still survive today.
Can you give us an example of that, this architectural dualism?
Oh, absolutely. Look at the Temple of Edfu, or Dendera, or Philae. These were all built during the Ptolemaic era, and they are purely 100% Egyptian in style, in iconography, and their whole decorative scheme. You see the Greek kings carved on the walls in traditional pharaonic dress, making offerings to Horus and Isis, all described in perfect hieroglyphs. It was proof to the gods and the people that these Greek rulers got it.
Meanwhile, just down the road, Alexandria is basically inventing Western intellectual thought.
It truly was the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world. It was a place devoted to the systematization of all knowledge, the Library of Alexandria. It wasn't a lending library like we think of it. It was this vast state archive, a research institution. It supposedly held hundreds of thousands of scrolls.
It's the sum of all knowledge at the time.
That was the goal. And it was attached to the museum, the Mausoleum, the Temple of the Muses, which was basically a state-funded university.
And this is where so many of those scientific breakthroughs happen.
Exactly. This is where Euclid systematized geometry. It's where Eratosthenes, the head librarian, calculated the circumference of the Earth with incredible accuracy just by measuring shadows. It's where Hero of Alexandria invented steam-powered devices, centuries ahead of its time.
And the physical symbol of the city itself.
The Pharaohs Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Maybe 350 feet tall, visible for dozens of miles out at sea. It wasn't just a lighthouse, it was a statement of Ptolemaic power, scientific achievement, and economic dominance.
It sounds like another golden age, at least intellectually. So what caused the Ptolemaic system to start failing?
It was a combination of things, really. Internal decay and external pressure. Internally, the Ptolemaic dynasty was plagued by infighting, sibling murder, civil wars. It became depressingly common, and economically they ran this highly centralized, often predatory state. The royal monopolies on things like grain and oil generated huge wealth for the crown, but it created a lot of resentment among the native Egyptians.
So that internal strife and economic mismanagement made them more and more reliant on the one power that was rising faster than anyone, Rome.
Precisely. By the 2nd century BC, Rome was the undisputed power in the Mediterranean. The later Ptolemies survived not because they were strong, but because they became strategically dependent client rulers of the Roman Republic. Their weakness allowed Rome to intervene again and again in Egyptian affairs.
And that, of course, brings us to the final act of this whole 3,000-year drama, embodied by the last pharaoh, Cleopatra VII.
She is probably the most famous and almost certainly the most misunderstood figure from the ancient world. The first thing to remember is she wasn't ethnically Egyptian, she was Macedonian Greek. But, and this is crucial, unlike her recent ancestors, she got it. She understood the power of Egyptian culture. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in centuries to actually learn the Egyptian language.
Which let her speak directly to the priests, to the people.
Right, it tells you everything about her political intelligence. She was highly educated, politically brilliant, and she knew her survival depended on one thing: maintaining Egypt's wealth and independence by allying herself with the most powerful man in Rome at any given time. And that first brought her to Julius Caesar in 48 BC.
The famous story of being smuggled in to see him rolled up in a carpet.
It's a great story, isn't it? It emphasizes her daring and her courage. She won Caesar's support, he backed her claim to the throne, and she bore him a son, Caesarion, creating this incredibly important and dangerous direct link to Roman power.
But then Caesar is assassinated, and she needs a new Roman anchor in that chaotic world.
She finds it in Mark Antony. Their alliance, both political and romantic, was incredibly successful for Egypt initially. She funded his military campaigns with Egyptian wealth, and in return, Antony gave back huge territories to Egypt, Cyprus, parts of the Levant, restoring some of that lost imperial glory. And he formally recognized her son, Caesarion.
And that act, recognizing Caesarion, was a direct challenge that Rome could not ignore.
That was the line in the sand. From Rome's perspective, an independent, fabulously wealthy Egypt, allied with a top Roman general like Antony, and with a potential heir who was half Roman, half Pharaoh. That was an existential threat. So Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and Antony's great rival, launched this masterful propaganda campaign, painting Cleopatra as this dangerous Eastern sorceress who was corrupting good Roman men.
The final showdown was a naval battle.
The Battle of Actium in 31 BC. The combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra was decisively beaten by Octavian's forces. They fled back to Egypt with Octavian in relentless pursuit.
And in 30 BC, with the end in sight, they made their final choices.
They both chose suicide over the humiliation of being paraded through Rome in a triumph. Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra's death by the bite of an asp or maybe a fast-acting poison was designed as a final, dignified, and very royal act, upholding the honor of her throne to the very end.
And with her death in 30 BC, the 3,000-year line of the Pharaohs, from Narmer all the way to the Ptolemies, was finally over.
The line was extinguished. Octavian, who would soon become the Emperor Augustus, made Egypt his personal property. It wasn't even a regular Roman province. It was too rich, too strategically vital with its grain supply, and too politically dangerous to be governed by the Senate. Control of Egypt meant control of Rome's food, and Augustus made sure that wealth flowed directly to him.
So Egypt is conquered. But, true to the pattern of this entire deep dive, the culture didn't just vanish overnight.
Not at all. It took centuries to truly fade away. Under Roman rule, the temples kept operating. Roman emperors were even depicted on temple walls as pharaohs, making offerings to the gods. It was that same Ptolemaic tradition of using religious compliance for political legitimacy. People were still mummified. The old religion persisted, especially out in the countryside.
So when did that final cultural shift really begin?
It was a slow, gradual erosion, driven mainly by the spread of Christianity, which started in the 1st century AD. It took root very quickly in Egypt, especially in Alexandria. And by the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the entire Roman Empire, the state pressure on the old religion became intense.
That's when the temples, the heart of the old state, finally started to close.
Yes. Many were systematically shut down, some were defaced, others were converted into Coptic churches. The Egyptian priesthoods, which had been the keepers of the ancient knowledge and the script for millennia, they just began to disappear. And we can pinpoint the end of the written tradition very precisely. The last known hieroglyphic inscription, just a bit of graffiti at the Temple of Philae, dates to 394 AD.
4 centuries into Roman rule, the language of the pharaohs finally goes silent after more than 3,000 years of continuous use.
And once the script wasn't used anymore, the knowledge of how to read it was lost. The spoken language evolved into Coptic, which used a modified Greek alphabet, but the history locked inside the hieroglyphs became completely inaccessible. For more than 1,000 years, the monument stood silent. Magnificent, but a total mystery.
A mystery that wasn't unlocked until the 19th century.
One of the great intellectual achievements of the modern era. When Napoleon's soldiers found the Rosetta Stone in 1799, we finally had the key. The same text written in hieroglyphs, in Demotic Egyptian, and in ancient Greek. And it was that stone that allowed Jean-François Champollion in 1822 to finally crack the code, effectively bringing ancient Egypt's voice back from 1,400 years of silence.
So let's zoom out now for the legacy. Beyond the pyramids and the temples, what did Egypt permanently give to the Western world?
Well, the foundations for several crucial concepts. In science, for example, the Egyptians laid the groundwork for systematic medicine, for surgery, for pharmacology. Their astronomical observations gave us the 365-day calendar, which is the direct ancestor of the one you and I use today.
And what about the deeper things, like philosophy and religion? That influence must be profound.
Oh, profoundly deep. The Egyptian concept of the afterlife as a place of moral judgment, the idea that your heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at and is followed by either eternal reward or punishment. That provided a foundational ethical framework that heavily influenced later Western religions. The whole idea of a judgment based on your deeds is distinctly Egyptian.
And we know the Greeks and Romans were obsessed with Egypt.
Completely. Egyptomania isn't new. It existed in the ancient world. The cult of Isis, for example, spread across the entire Roman Empire. It was one of the most popular mystery cults, a major rival to early Christianity.
And what about aesthetics? The idea of monumental power.
They pioneered the architectural philosophy that a state should build for eternity. The idea that art and architecture should be used to explicitly proclaim power, piety, and permanence. When you look at a Roman triumphal arch or Gothic cathedral, or really any monument that's meant to defy time, that concept starts in the Nile Valley.
It's just staggering when you think about the time scale, 30 dynasties.
Yeah.
Monuments that were already ancient legends when the Roman Republic was just a backwater. They really did build for forever.
They absolutely did. I mean, the New Kingdom pharaohs looked back on the pyramid builders with the same kind of time distance that we look back on, I don't know, the signing of the Magna Carta. It's an almost incomprehensible depth of time that frames everything that came after.
And yet, even with everything we've recovered since Champollion, the story still isn't finished.
Not even close. And that's the most exciting part for modern archaeology. The political system of the pharaohs might have ended in 30 BC, but the cultural archive is still being unlocked. New technologies, satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, DNA analysis of mummies are constantly revealing things the early excavators could never have found.
So we are still actively recovering the legacy of this civilization.
We are. The sheer amount of material and the depth of the sand that covers it means we have barely scratched the surface. The story is still being written. The mystery is still there.
I think the most provocative thought for you, our listener, to take away is this. If we've spent 200 years recovering just a fraction of Egypt's history from the desert, what fundamental secrets, what profound influences might still be buried out there beneath the sands that we can't even begin to imagine today? Egypt's long story just continues to amaze.
The foundation it laid for our world, it's a constant, even thousands of years after its political end.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the extraordinary history and the enduring legacy